Well, hello all. Game Methuselah. I know it's been a little while. I would treat you to my tale of woes, but frankly, it's boring and nobody wants to hear it. I ran my D&D Zero at Mini Wars a couple weeks ago before my malady struck me, and I had a real interesting time. What was interesting about it to me is I remembered why I liked original D&D so much. When Gary Gygax passed away, I ran for Matt and the Disciples a D&D Zero game to show them how it was in 1976. And I laid it all out, and I think all you've heard of it in the interview with Matt and I. And everyone commented on the fact that that was it. There really just wasn't that much. Now, it had been over 20 years since I had run D&D Zero, and even though I sort of brushed up on it before we ran, I was pretty rusty and running it pretty standard. But then when I played a couple weeks ago, it was a much different deal. I played very much like we did back in the 70s. I made it a 1975, no Greyhawk, absolute 3 books, the original D&D Zero as it came out. I have, of course, all the painted miniatures. I had a mat that came from the 70s. I covered it with plastic and had a nice grease pencil so it could very much have that feel. I had some hand-drawn tiles that Steve Kish had done. I had some other things. So there was a little bit of visuals, but it was the kind of visuals you had back in the day. Not as dramatic, obviously, as the dungeon tiles and things are now, but it worked and people were pretty impressed because I had painted miniatures and I had a map drawn. And that's the way the game went. But the thing is, what I remembered and what happened in our game is we had lots of player DM interaction where, since there really are no rules stated in D&D Zero, there's not something like, well, what does a ranger do and what does a fighter do and what does a rogue do and all these things. It's pretty much left up to the players. And that's what we did then, and that's what I did a couple weeks ago. The player I was with went along. I said, look, you can do anything you want. You just have to tell it to me. And if I don't quite understand, then you need to sort of explain it to me. Now, of course, I was going to understand most of it, but some novice game masters might not. So in a situation in the battle where his wizard was trying to draw attention off of the fighter who was wounded so he could recover and then be able to get back into the fray, he said, look, I'm going to try to poke the staff in his face, and maybe I won't do any damage, but hope to distract him. I said, of course, that's fine. So go ahead and make the roll. He rolled a critical. I said, well, not only did you poke it in his face, you poked him in the eye, and he's now blinded in one eye and fights at a disadvantage for the remainder of the battle. That's how the game used to play. Since there were no rules, there was so much left up to both the game master and the players. Thusly, the concept of cooperative storytelling was really important. Now, it was all new, and in many ways, all the new rules are really nice. They're all quantified. You have everything detailed. You know exactly what your character can do at every level with every item. But back then, there really wasn't. It was such kind of an open field that people often would make up their own house rules. If you go down to the Warhouse in Long Beach, talk to Steve Lucky and ask for an issue of his Spartan with the Caltech rules, you can see what Caltech did in 1976 to use their own homebrew rules and put them out to the world. Now, we didn't really use them. We used sort of a hodgy-podgy mixed bag of spell points and easier recovery on spells and other things, because nobody was ever happy with the concept of once you cast your spell, it was gone for the day. And I think that's been a fight in D&D ever since. It led to my leaving D&D and going on to Chivalry and Sorcery, even though the magic system in that game was almost unplayable. And I think only 2 people I ever know even attempted to run a wizard. It was super detailed for the fighters, which Dungeons & Dragons was not. The fighter knights, the warriors, the elves, the dwarves, it was very specific how they could fight and the advantages and disadvantages they had. So that appealed to me. And then when the fantasy trip later came out, and the fact that spells were based upon you using up your magical energy to cast them, and that what you knew was based upon your intelligence, it was very much more dynamic. A very beginning level A magic user could cast multiple spells in a dungeon, in any combat even, and then be able to then heal up or rest up between combats to regain their magical power. That made that very appealing to me because the game played at a very high level right from the beginning, not that sort of progressive situation where you start out very weak in D&D and at the end, obviously, you're little demigods. Now, I find somebody pointed out to me that actually these type of games like the Fantasy Trip ended up becoming the rule, and only Dungeons and Dragons, Pathfinder, of course, because they are basing on D&D, have this concept of you start out as nothing and then eventually you become fabulous. And I kind of like it. And a lot of people, I think, like it for that reason. It's the struggle in the beginning with the idea that eventually you will be super powerful, assuming you survive. But what I would state to most game masters is either look at D&D Zero, you can find it online at the D&D site and download it to your phone or iPad and read about it. But more, even in any modern rules, utilize the concept that existed when D&D first came out. If it wasn't excluded in the rules, you could pretty much do it, up to what the game master was willing to do. So some game masters who are not really well versed at the game felt nervous about letting people do things, but ones who really knew it, like myself, we did all kinds of things, heroic leaps and jumps and all these things that didn't exist in the rules, which have now sort of come into the game, could be done. And I'd suggest you even add that into your current games, whatever system you're using. I used to use, and I didn't really tell the players about it, the concept of fate. Certain characters became fated by the things they did in games. The more heroic the players played their characters, the more dramatic things they did, the more interaction that they had, the more they drove the story forth. I would look at that and realize this character was a fated character. So at times, I would allow him to modify things, very much like Advantage does now. You could modify abilities or magical strikes, desperate situations, some kind of sort of heroic mission to try to save the day. You might give them an advantage. You can roll and add to the die. Or you might just roll to the die, where suddenly they roll a 16 or an 18, and you tell them they've criticaled, and they don't quite understand it, but somehow the gods have intervened. I think this was a fun way to play. With the game less quantified, or more quantified now, but less quantified then, there was much more you can do. I remember running into a brick wall the first time I ran Dungeons and Dragons for the Pad group. Dave Miles, and maybe most everyone else who was playing at the time, had a huge objection to the fact that I had run this troll that did not come out of the monster manual. I mean, he has some basic factors, approximately the same hit points, approximately the same armor class, and everything else. But instead of attacking the way the troll did in the book, the Dungeon Master's Guide, or the Monster Manual, he swung a big tree in a sweeping blow motion and could attack everybody in front of him. Now, Dave piped up and said, wait, that's not a troll. It doesn't say that in the rules. And I thusly pointed out to him in the rule says the Dungeon Master can make any modifications he wanted. That did not work. That left a bad taste in everybody's mouth, and they didn't want to play that way. They wanted the game quantified. So, like Quigley Down Under, just because I said I didn't care for it, didn't mean I didn't know how to use it. I quickly was able to adapt and utilize the book and the layering that was going on in 3.5 at the time to make the creatures I wanted to do the things I wanted them to do. But in most other games and in original D&D, you just did it. And I think that would be good to bring back. Allow players to do more. Sometimes when I play in Adventure League, I feel like, the modules are written and they're very, very fixed and everybody runs them the same. The variety in the game comes from how spectacularly different people can create a character to be fantastic in the game, even though he's odd or strange or different. And it's kind of like they're doing it because that is the way to make the game fun. To have a broken character or an unusual character or a strange character that you're utilizing to do things that he could not normally do. Now, I was a bad offender in this in 3.5. I had my barbarian half-orc monk priest of Yandala. It's a long story. And he really broke the game. I mean, he was a rule game breaker, and I used every trick in the book to do it, and every magical item combination until I made a character that was pretty omnipotent. I've stopped doing that now, and I really tend to run, as I pointed out in one of my other videos, just sort of basic characters. I want to run them so they support the story. And as I had said in my original video with Matt, when he asked me how I think about my characters when I generate them, I say I try to make characters that help the DM move his story forward. Because to me, it's the great interaction, the cooperative storytelling, as it were, that really makes the game appealing. Without that, you end up with a sort of hodgepodge of characters that you can't even sure why they're in the world, let alone running together in a campaign. And that doesn't always work well. I think it's actually better to do something like Matt pointed out to me in D&D 0, where he said the game master basically decided everything in the beginning. He would decide your characters, he'd make the rolls, he'd do all these things. Now, I sort of believe that's because they originally felt that the DM was more likely the only guy who was going to have the different shaped dice and be the one who's going to have to break the rolls because no one will have any dice. But that quickly changed. And that rule, as far as I can recall, never was enacted in any group I've ever played with. But when you play games, start letting people do more things. Say, look, if there's something you want to do, if there's some way you vision your character that's different from maybe the standard ranger type or the standard bard or the standard rogue or whatever, or your fighter, and if you envision him a certain way, talk to me about it. We can work out ways for you to do things, and they don't always need to be totally quantified. You can say, look, there is a chance if you do certain things that the gods will smile upon you, or whatever you want to use, and it might modify your die. And not modify the roll, actually modify the die. It's a really interesting feature that got used in the fantasy trip. When you would make a roll with a fencing skill, it actually modified your die. So thusly, in this, if you could modify your die by 2 because of some really special ability, you roll an 18, you can change the 18 to a 20, you just critted. You know, that with multiple attacks or advantage can really make this game more dynamic. And that dynamic play, I think, is what you want. The other thing is create your own monsters. You know, I talked about this previous. Do things that are different, things that are unexpected. Come out with trolls that aren't out of the book, that do different things. You know, Grendel trolls. Bruce Schleckburn, many years ago, decades ago in D&D 0, had come up with a creature because the Escaladio had gotten to the point and characters were becoming very high level and magic users ruled the day. He created a creature, and I do not remember what it was called. I named it Onsigum, which is just no magic, you know, spelled backwards. But what it did was, whatever level of spell you threw at it, it went up that many levels, took no damage. But what the creature would do is it was related to the doppelganger. So it would take on the appearance of something like an Umber Hulk or a troll or some large meleeing type creature that was about, you know, ogre size that it could actually shapeshift into and thusly attract the magical spells, so that by the time it hit the front rank of a party, after being hit by a fireball and a lightning bolt and an ice storm, it was hugely powerful. 20, 25, 28th level, tons of hit dice, very difficult for the party to deal with. And that really made for an interesting change in dynamic. People started detecting levels, so they'd throw a first level spell and then say, you know, did they go up a level? And, you know, it was an interesting way to bring more uncertainty in the game. And I think the adventure and the uncertainty is really beneficial. The monster's obviously great for the DM, but let your characters change it up. Maybe they have an idea of something entirely different, like Matt did when he played my Albion campaign, and he wanted to run a Atlantean paladin. But it wasn't a paladin that had fighting abilities, it was a paladin that had magical abilities. So it was kind of a really reverse trend on the item. And I said, look, you're experienced. You just figure out how it works. We'll go with it. You know, if I find out there are problems, we can always just, you know, smooth those over. But invariably, they're not problems. Good gamers get motivated by the game, and they will come up and enhance your game by running really excellent characters. So give them a chance. Try it in 5th edition. Say, look, I want to run a real fixed adventure, but you can modify your characters however you see them within this limited parameter. So no funky, weird creatures that aren't going to be in my world. No dragonborn or no lizard men are going to be in the same party with the elves and the dwarves. However you want to run it, or however they want to run it. I mean, they may want a game where there are no humans. Everybody's a lizard man or a dragonborn or something. That's all up to you. But give them an idea to shape the characters the way they envision them. And I think they'll surprise you in how many unusual and interesting concepts they can come up. Because as I looked and as I played my D&D Zero, I realized this is how we did it. It was all made up on the fly. Sure, there was a monster manual, but nobody ever used it. It made no sense. A Balrog at 10th level with D6 hits meant he had about 30, 35 hits, which means he'd last about 3 rounds in any sort of high-level game. No. No one did that. Balrogs were powerful. They had additional abilities and magical things they could do, and that made them dangerous and exciting. And the game has gone that way, as I'm sure you know if you open up a monster manual for 5th edition. And if you look at 4th edition, you can find all kinds of incredible things. But add those in. Change your game just a little bit and see how they like it. Now, I suggest you actually download the D&D Zero and run some of that. Let people see it. And from that point, since there are no rules, they're going to want to jump to make up items. They're going to say, look, I want to shield the wizard with my shield. What does that do? And I said, well, you increase his armor class and you decrease your armor class, and you make any attack you make a little less effective. But it doesn't have to be much. So you reduce your defense by 1, you increase his defense by 2, and you maybe give yourself a -1 on the attack. But you could add those numbers depending upon whatever you want to do. You might say, no, I'm going to totally give up my defense to protect the wizard. Well, maybe now it's an AC up bump of 6. You suddenly lose the full ability of the shield. But suddenly, since you're concentrating on protecting the wizard, you can add a 6. You get no attack. There's all kinds of things you can do because it's your game. And you want that cooperative game. You don't want it to just be I roll my die, I miss. I roll my die, I hit. I do my special ability, I hit. I get to attack twice, I hit or miss or whatever. That gets kind of, I don't know if I can pick up the right word. It just seems like it lacks the verisimilitude. There it is. The realism that you get. Let the players give and take in the combat. Let them do things that are heroic. Let them do things that are maybe ridiculous. And maybe you don't give it much of a chance of working, but maybe you do, depending upon the situation. Maybe it's a surprise. Anyway, I just wanted to get a video to see how the new camera works, and I'm pretty much sure it's going to work like the old camera, but I thought maybe this would be of some help to you. If you're not interested, just toss it out and keep doing what you're doing. I'm sure you're having fun, and that's the main goal. But really, if you want to feel a lot of what the old games were like, put your players in a point where they're interacting more with the game. I think they'll have some more fun. I think some of it will find it interesting. They might not. You can always go back to what you're doing. But I think it'll give you a context to think about the game and make it so you can come up with more creative ideas for your campaigns. So I'm going to cut it off now and let it go from there. Put this back up, and hopefully I'll have not forgotten how to use everything on the editing software. So until we have a chance to speak again, fight me, devils, fight, for I hate peace. Game on.